Hello, English 423 and 523. Today I'm just going to give you a few thoughts about Charlotte Perkins Gilman's through the lens of thinking about oppression and both kyriarchy and patriarchy, which are two concepts that basically address how certain groups, in case of patriarchy, specifically women, are oppressed through systematic cultural means. Now, uh, almost anyone who reads the Yellow Wallpaper is going to pick up on the clear theme of misogyny and gender oppression going on in the story. You have a character who clearly just needs to be let out of prison. And it's pretty clear that what she's dealing with is postpartum depression, and that the treatment that they're giving it, for it is to separate her from her baby and to lock her inside and not allow her to write or do anything that might overstimulate her. Um, but what comes across in the text, first of all, that's terrible medicine, terrible psychology, and that's just super obvious right from the get-go. The last thing you want to do to someone who's suffering from postpartum depression is to separate her from her child. Um, Also, even in terms depression in general, you wouldn't want to deliberately isolate someone. That isolation is very obvious, and they're very obviously going to have negative effects on the person being isolated. But this isn't really a story about a single person. That's what makes literature so fascinating to us. Is it's never just a story about one person. It's a story about all of us. And if it's about one woman being oppressed in a rather sort of naive way by her husband, who I think we can take the narrator at her word means well, um, it's really a reflection of the systematic oppression of women. And what's interesting is how we can take a look at that and see how oppression works sort of on a large scale. In many of my classes, I've talked to students about one way that you can recognize the techniques of oppression in society, and what we would call a hegemonic masculinity in this case, is to look at how abuse works. If you've ever known someone to be in an abusive relationship, you recognize certain things right away that are abusive. Now, some of this is obvious. Physical, assault or threats, violence or the threat of violence is, of course, one way to oppress someone. Now, that's not really happening in this text. There's no threat of violence being enacted here. And in fact, the husband doesn't come across as violent at all. So this is much more subtle forms of oppression, but some other things that are clearly uh, abusive. One is if you have a friend who's being abused by his or her partner, you'll notice that that person is becoming isolated, that the jealousy is really presents itself through a distrust of that person being around other people. So you isolate the person. In this case, that takes quite literal form in terms of imprisonment. The other thing is silencing. If someone is suspicious whenever someone's on the cell phone or wants to take a look at their messages or their message history, or to take a look at their phone bill, which was more of a thing back before cell phones existed, to find out who that person was contacting. These are all both isolation and also surveillance. And you'll notice that our narrator in this particular story is both isolated and surveilled, that there's someone constantly keeping an eye on her. Also, there is this attack or dehumanization that happens where the person is made to feel like they are not less than human or less than an adult, and you can see that in the way that the husband talks to his wife. Also, there are instances here in the text where we can see that the author, sorry, a little symbol popped up on my computer there, where the husband is extremely controlling of her and creates a dependency, so making the person feel like they can't survive without you. All of these things are techniques of abuse, and if you expand them into a larger sense, they become exactly identical to techniques of oppression. So what you do to emotionally or psychologically abuse an individual these are exactly the same techniques that governments and societies use, and sometimes without even really being conscious of it, to infantilize and dehumanize and oppress large groups of people. In this case, we're talking about women. And when it becomes systematic, and indeed, when even women start participating in that oppression, we call that a patriarchy. We call it the systematic oppression of one group. And this affects all different areas. So we see, and it's very important that the husband is a doctor in here. A doctor is a position of authority. And of course, historically, we can look at the problems in terms of gender performance and gender attitudes in medicine. Women's medicine lags far behind many different kind of medical fields because for years they didn't take women's health issues seriously, especially postpartum depression, but also the idea for years doctors would say that menstrual cramps weren't real; they were all in a woman's head. They were not a real thing. And even in psychology, there are whole fields of psychology devoted to trying to understand women's hysteria, and that was a Freudian term for the insanity that comes over a woman who is sexually repressed. Now, this story has stayed with us because it seems to really dramatize all of those things. It isn't really a question whether or not the narrator is crazy. She does go crazy. But what's interesting about the story is that she didn't start that way. She is driven crazy by the people who are trying to help her and protect her. This has implications that go well beyond Gilman and carry on into especially 20th century Southern literature that explores women's lives, women who were protected by white men, both from African American men and from the specter of lesbianism, and that this protection is, if you think about it symbolically, you can protect someone by building a wall around them, but we also call that a prison. And the ways in which men have historically tried to protect women, even with good intentions, have often resulted in their isolation, imprisonment, and entrapment. And this story is replete with images of isolation and entrapment. Some other things to keep in mind here. This story, even though it's firmly within a psychological realist world, it certainly is an exploration of how we realistically experience. So if it's possible to give a realistic depiction about how someone goes insane, here it is, right? But also, the story seems to be a reaction against a lot of naturalistic and realistic attitudes of the time that are in particular misogynistic. And we see this in Sarah Orne Jewett's work and Friedman's work in the New England Nun, is this attack on this sort of over practicality. The husband is a perfect realist, a perfect naturalist in every way. But he does not believe. This results in him basically not believing in feelings, not believing in emotions, which of course are very real. And in some people's hands, in fact, Henry James's hands quite often, feelings are identified as feminine, and where in the Romantics they would idealize, admittedly, a stereotypical representation of what is feminine in beauty and fragility and emotion. The naturalists become almost a sort of oftentimes toxic masculine attack on those very things. And it's in some ways both of these perceptions of women are confining and threatening. I think it's particularly important to think about these issues as we look forward into thinking about what does it mean to be a free citizen if you're a woman in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. The next week, we're going to look at some dangerous women and some of their writing. So this is actually a very good stepping off point for thinking about how women carved out an artistic niche for themselves in not only a world, but a literary movement that was threatened by them and often threatening to them. So, we're going to take a look at some dangerous women over the next week. All right, that's all I've got for you today. I'm looking forward to reading your reading responses, and I hope that you are all well and that you're keeping up with your work and you're starting to really think about what you want to do for those term papers. Okay, bye.